Russia is closing in on Ukraine's capital as a full-scale invasion rages on for a second day. Fierce fighting has been reported on the outskirts of Kiev, raising concerns the city's defenses might soon be breached. Battle is also being waged in other major cities. Ukraine has declared a general mobilization to resist the Russian war machine. Defense officials are even roping in civilians, calling those on the ground to alert them to troop movements. Ukraine says more than 130 people have been killed and over 300 injured. Live to Kiev, Beijing, Brussels and the Russian border with Ukraine in just a moment. But first, how Ukraine is battling for its survival.
It was a sleepless night in Ukraine. Battles have been raging across the country, in the air and on the ground, with the heaviest fighting seen in the eastern breakaway regions. Explosions lit up across the sky as Russia hit Kiev with multiple airstrikes. Ukraine's military says it intercepted a number of missiles and downed an enemy aircraft, which then crashed into a residential building.
Шум, что-то летало или упало. Я встал, посмотрел в окно, ничего не увидел, отошел сюда, и после взрыва вот я оказался в такой выгодной точке, чтобы увидеть, как вот все окна складываются внутрь отсюда и оттуда. Чудом никто не пострадал.
Ukraine has accused Russia of lying about not targeting civilians. Officials say more than 30 residential areas have been hit so far, forcing many to seek shelter underground. Despite the chaos, Ukraine's leader has vowed to stay put and continue the fight.
І я залишаюсь в столиці. Моя родина також в Україні. Мої діти також в Україні. Моя сім'я не зрадники, а громадяни України. Але де вони зараз знаходяться, я сказати не маю права. За наявною у нас інформацією, ворог позначив мене як ціль номер 1. Мою родину як ціль номер 2. Вони хочуть знищити Україну політично, знищивши главу держави.
Mr. Zelenskyy has made a fresh appeal to Moscow for a ceasefire. At the same time, he has criticized international sanctions on Russia, saying they are not enough.
Цим ранком ми захищаємо нашу державу наодинці. Як і вчора, найпотужніші сили світу спостерігають здалеку. Чи переконали Росію вчорашні санкції? Ми чуємо у своєму небі і бачимо на своїй землі, що цього недостатньо. Чужі війська все ще намагаються активізуватись на нашій території.
Japan has joined Australia and New Zealand in strengthening sanctions against Russia. The moves target banks, military exports, and members of Vladimir Putin's inner circle.
Reporter Yosef Federman joins us live from Kiev. Yosef, Russia closing in on Kiev, but Ukrainian forces still fighting back.
Yes, they're trying to put up a defense, but it's clear that the Russians are moving in quickly. The reports are that they're just inside the city, just a few kilometers from where I'm standing. It was a long night here. We had repeated air raid sirens running up and down into shelters, into the basement for protection. And throughout the day, we have heard more sirens, explosions off in the distance, but even one not too long ago, clearly getting closer to where we are.
With sirens and explosions getting closer, how are people in Kiev enduring this conflict?
Yeah, we took a walk a little, and we're in Maidan Square, near Maidan Square, the main square in central Kiev, and it felt almost like a ghost town. Very few people, just a handful of stragglers sort of milling about, but the streets are largely empty. People are staying indoors. They're scared. They're worried about what's coming.
Ukraine's leader, that's Volodymyr Zelenskyy, hitting out at international sanctions on Russia, saying these are insufficient. Now, he has said, who is ready to fight with us? I'm asking them, are you with us? Is Mr. Zelenskyy actually expecting other forces to be fighting alongside Ukrainian forces?
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry, there's some noise.
Essentially, President Zelenskyy has said international sanctions against Russia are not enough. He has said, who is ready to fight with us? I'm asking them, are you with us? Is the president actually expecting outside forces to be standing on the ground alongside Ukrainian forces?
Yeah, I think that is his hope, but there are no signs of that happening. The U.S. Has made it clear it has no intention of sending troops into Ukraine. They've been sending troops to near Ukraine, to fellow NATO allies, but they do not want to get involved in the conflict at this stage. So for the time being, you have appeals from Ukraine for help. You have sanctions, and those sanctions, as you mentioned, are getting stronger with the latest round. But sanctions, as you know, take a long time to hit. They don't always work against the targets that you hope for. So there's a long road ahead before those sanctions take effect. So what we expect to see is no sign of either side backing down, more fighting, and very likely the Russians will continue to advance.
Thanks to the AP reporter Yosef Federman in Kiev.
Julia Chapman joins us live now from Rostov-on-Don in Russia for more. Julia, Russia seemingly undeterred, unfazed by these stronger new sanctions that have been imposed, as well as the threat to cut Moscow off from the global financial system.
Russian officials have been incredibly dismissive of all the sanctions that have been introduced so far. The Kremlin this morning saying that it will retaliate against the measures that have been introduced so far. President Vladimir Putin's spokesperson, Dmitry Peskov, admitting that Moscow would see some problems caused by them, but they could overcome them eventually, not accepting that this will do any kind of major damage to Russia. Officials have been referring to these as unfriendly and ineffective measures that are being introduced against Moscow. But undoubtedly, these are some of the toughest sanctions we have ever seen issued against a country. Russian oligarchs, banks, lawmakers, among others, have been targeted by the EU, UK, US, and other countries. We've also been seeing one of Russia's biggest airlines, or Russia's biggest airline, its national flag carrier Aeroflot, blocked from landing in the United Kingdom. And these, we understand, are just the first round of sanctions. There are still more to come if things get worse. Certainly, European leaders calling for Russia to hold fire, to stop its offensive against Russia, those calls being echoed in other Western capitals and Eastern ones as well, as there is a lot of concern about what is going on, as we've just been hearing in Kiev and elsewhere around Ukraine. But the sanctions certainly haven't had any material impact in the fighting on the ground. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy saying earlier today that there are still bombs being dropped on Ukraine, even though the sanctions were introduced. He wants the West and the rest of the world to go further.
Well, the issue of sanctions and whether or not they're working or will work, Julia, Russia has banned UK-registered planes from landing at its airports or crossing its airspace, an apparent retaliatory move to that Aeroflot move. What does it signal?
Well, this is the first of Russia's retaliatory measures. It says that all sanctions will be retaliated against, possibly in an asymmetrical way. And we are already seeing that. The Russian Federal Aviation Authority announced earlier today that British airlines will not be allowed to, never mind just land in Russia, but even enter Russian airspace. And of course, Russia is the largest country in the world. When flights go from London to pretty much anywhere in Asia, they have to travel through Russia to go the most direct route. Russia makes quite a lot of money through these transit fees. Russia is one of the most expensive countries to transit through in the air. But now British Airways are not going to be allowed to enter Russian airspace, and that is going to make things much more difficult for their routes to Asia. According to analysts, that means they will either have to stop in the Middle East and refuel along the way because the journey will be that much longer, or refuel somewhere in Alaska going west instead of east to get to Asia. So undoubtedly, this is going to complicate things a lot for travel between Europe and Asia. And this is certainly just the first of what is being threatened in a series of measures by the Russian government.
Julia, thank you for that. Julia Chapman there in Rostov-on-Don, Russia.
NATO is expected to convene a virtual meeting of its 30 leaders later today to discuss the security situation in and around Ukraine and weigh its next steps to the Russian invasion. Rosie Burchard joins us live from Brussels. Rosie, what further action can we expect from NATO?
Well, NATO allies will be sitting around the table virtually later today to discuss what their next step can really be. Now, whether Ukraine can expect further support is a question mark. We might expect some individual NATO allies to make some offers of support to Ukraine, for example, in the form of weapons or military assets. But what we certainly cannot expect is any NATO troops within Ukraine, so any NATO boots on the ground, because that is simply because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and that means it's not party to the alliance's collective defence pledge. What we might expect is to see NATO allies discussing their further reinforcing their eastern flank. So we heard just a day or two ago from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. He announced the alliance has activated its defensive plans. That's kind of shrouded in mystery. We don't know exactly what they entail, but we know they were drawn up in 2014 in response to the annexation of Crimea, and they're essentially designed to give the alliance's top military commander more flexibility so that he does not have to go back to member states to check in before taking action. So we might hear more on that. We will be expecting more on this from the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg in just a few hours' time on what NATO plans to do next. But of course, they are just scratching their heads and trying to work out what the Russian President Vladimir Putin's next move might be. And I think certainly nobody here in Brussels could answer that question.
Rosie, it's clear now, no actual military intervention from NATO or any one country. What we're seeing is economic reprisals, EU tightening sanctions on Russia, but stopping short, at least at this point, cutting off Moscow from the SWIFT international payments network. Why?
Well, that was certainly an issue that was perhaps debated around the table of EU leaders yesterday evening, Thursday evening in Brussels. All 27 leaders held an emergency summit in one of these buildings behind me, and they were there late into the night. Now, they quite early on, after an hour or two of talks, released a statement saying they were proceeding with sanctions. They insist these sanctions are massive and that they're going to be crippling the Russian government's capacity to finance this war. However, as you mentioned, they have stopped short of one of the most controversial issues, and that is whether or not to cut Russia off from the SWIFT payment system. That is something Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy has publicly criticised the European Union for. And when it comes to why, well, there are a few reasons. First of all, let's be clear, this is 27 governments sitting around a table. All of them have different foreign policy issues. All of them have different industries. All of them have different key economic sectors. And what is clear here in Europe, the EU as a geographical neighbour of both Russia and Ukraine, is that the European Union, these countries are more likely to bear the impact of any Russian counter-sanctions. So we've heard from Donald Tusk, who's the former president of the European Council. He's publicly called out some countries he accuses of blocking further sanctions or harsher sanctions. He mentioned Germany and Italy. I certainly wasn't in that room, so I couldn't confirm that otherwise. But he has been very critical of those countries. And I think moving forward, the questions that are coming from critics are, why not go forward with a fuller package of sanctions now? There is already a war right on the EU's doorstep. And it must be said, this is something felt very keenly and very closely by those EU countries which share borders with Ukraine. There are 4 countries, including Poland, and they're just across the border from this conflict. So it's certainly something that here in Europe is felt that it's very close to home.
Oh, thanks for that, Rosie Burchard in Brussels.
Chinese President Xi Jinping has spoken to his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, as the crisis in Ukraine mounts. Olivia Xiong joins us live from Beijing. Olivia, what exactly did the two leaders discuss?
Well, Dawn, we have just heard in the last hour that the two leaders spoke over the phone this afternoon, where state media reported that they had exchanged views on the situation in Ukraine. Now, it's reported that Mr. Putin hit out at the U.S. and NATO for ignoring Russia's reasonable security concerns and accusing them of repeatedly going back on their commitments and continuing to advance militarily eastward, challenging what he said was Russia's strategic bottom line. At the same time, though, it's reported that Russia is willing to conduct high-level negotiations with Ukraine. Now, this is something that President Xi seems to have agreed with, even though he largely reiterated what China has been saying in the last few days. President Xi saying that China decides its position based on the merits of the Ukraine issue itself, and calling on all parties to abandon the Cold War mentality and to respect the legitimate security concerns of all countries, echoing what Mr. Putin had to say. Now, Mr. Xi also said that China supports Russia's and Ukraine to resolve the issue through negotiations, and that he also reiterated China's basic position that the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all countries needs to be respected, and that China is willing to work with all parties and the international community to come up with some sort of resolution to this crisis.
Thank you, Olivia. Olivia Xiong reporting live